do have a very thrilling evening prepared for you tonight. And it comes at a critical moment for all of us. We know we're living very deeply through a climate crisis. We're shocked by daily headlines, such as yesterday, that Antarctic temperatures were 40 degrees above normal and 30 degrees above normal in the Arctic. And we have an extinction crisis, a nature loss crisis. We, like communities all over the world, are living it and grappling with action internationally, nationally, but mainly here in Ottawa, in where we live, work, and play. After 2 years of the pandemic, severe weather events, now a war in Ukraine, which reminds us how we have to stop our fossil fuel addiction, which is killing people and planet. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said today, addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction. We need to fix the broken global energy mix. Instead of hitting the brakes on decarbonization, now's the time to race towards the renewable energy future. And we know cities have a key role in doing so. So we're here tonight, thrilled to have a very timely keynote address by David Miller on city-based climate action. After David's talk, we have a panel on Ottawa's forward environmental agenda with councillors Moffat and Menard from the Environment Committee, co-chairs, and we have time for questions and comments after each of those sections. And again, we'll ask you to do so through the chat. And that will wrap up the conversational portion at about 8:30. We'll have a quick 5-minute break, and then we will come back for our business portion of the AGM. And this is an important time to have these conversations. We have pressing issues in each and every one of our communities. We have a provincial and a municipal election this year, and we are deeply in need and eager to hear some collective new ideas for collective action. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming David Miller. David Miller was the mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010. He served as chair of C40 Cities for 3 years, and under his leadership, Toronto became widely admired internationally for its environmental leadership, economic strength, and social integration. And of note to all of us here in Ottawa, it was under David's leadership that Toronto put in place the Toronto Green Standard. And we're here in Ottawa, we are working on our first Green Standard right now, which is going to council in April, called the High Performance Development Standard that CAFES has worked very intensively on. Many of you have worked very hard on. David is currently the managing director of C40 Centre for Urban Climate Policy and Economy. And just as CAFES is a network of community associations who care about action in cities, C40 is a network of cities. And like us, they believe municipalities are key to action required to address the climate crisis. Emissions and adaptation need to take place in cities. It need to take place, yes, where we live and work, and that is in our cities. David has recently published a book, Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. And we hope to make Ottawa one such great city. So with that, David, we look forward to hearing from you some of the ideas of how together we can do so. So we welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Liz, thanks very much for the welcome, and everyone for supporting CAFES, for caring about the environment and climate change, and for being here tonight. I actually grew up in Ottawa, and I'll mention that in a second, but I just want to mention in the context of the land acknowledgement, because although I grew up in Ottawa, I had the privilege of being mayor of Toronto. I'm currently in Victoria and on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, so I'd like to acknowledge that before starting, and I'm going to try to share my screen. Right, that should be working, and in a second I will get it into slideshow format. There we go.
Yes.
Is that working, Liz? Yes, excellent. So I did grow up in Ottawa. I went to Arch Street Public School and Hawthorne Elementary.
I'm trying to be good about everything. I'm just sort of like, okay, it would be, oh.
Somebody's off mic. There we go. Thanks very much. Hawthorne Elementary, and lived in the Canterbury Apartments right next door to Canterbury High School at the time when Russ Jackson was the principal, for those of a certain age. So I've got a soft spot for Ottawa, and I'm really glad to hear the potential progress and applaud the efforts of the relevant councillors and the citizens who are really working together through CAFES and elsewhere to promote city-led climate action. What I wanted to talk about tonight, fairly briefly, but to help set the context, is my perspective globally on city-based climate action, the urgency and the possibilities, and I'll touch on what we're seeing globally, then speak a little bit about Toronto, and I'll mention the Green Building Standard and how it came about in case it's relevant, and then I understand there's a little bit of time for questions. So hopefully if I can keep the time, we'll have some time for questions and a conversation. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm thrilled to have a chance to be here. So as Liz mentioned, my current role, there we go, is as the Managing Director of the C40 Center for Urban Climate Policy and Economy. That's a new think tank set up in January to bring together the best thinking from practitioners, from cities, from policy and action people based in cities, and academics about how to address the climate challenge from a city perspective and from an economic perspective. The theory being that our current economic arrangements are part of the problem of climate change. So how do we create new economic arrangements, particularly at city scale, that put our planet where it should be, which is right in the middle of the conversation. As those of you who study economics know, our economic theories sort of assume the planet is an exogenous thing, when in reality, of course, we only have one planet, and we have to make sure to take care of it. So C40, just by background, is a network originally of 40 of the world's largest cities. It was established by then London Mayor Ken Livingstone in 2005. And Ken's idea was that the voices and the actions of the mayors of the world's major cities could help the world avoid climate catastrophe. And originally, Ken had thought about bringing together the capitals of the G20 countries. He pretty quickly realized, based on the advice of a number of his peers, including Toronto was a founding member, that really it wasn't just the capitals you needed. For example, United States, you didn't just need Washington. If you're going to be a network of the world's great cities, you needed New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago as well. The other founding principle, as you can see from this graph, is that half of the cities are from the global south and half from the global north. So cities like Jakarta are extremely important and active members of C40. It's grown from that time to 97. We will not go over 100. Sometimes cities are asked to leave if they're not showing enough leadership on climate. And a couple of really important and relevant things from my perspective about C40 cities that are relevant to what Ottawa is trying to do and relevant to what any city is trying to do. After the Paris Accord at COP21, C40 had a summit the next year in Mexico City. And as you might remember, in Paris, the world acknowledged how serious climate change was and came to an agreement which gave us all hope. But the agreement was to try to keep overall global average temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees. And we knew then, and we certainly know now, that that's inadequate. The target must be keeping overall global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less. We're almost there already. The only way to do this is to cut overall carbon emissions more or less in half by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. And there's even controversy about whether we have to be at net zero or absolute zero. I put that aside a little bit because the most important thing is what we do today. Because if we don't immediately get on a path to having overall global emissions by 2030, it won't be possible to avoid climate disaster. And we've seen in Canada what this means. You know, Lytton, British Columbia, literally burnt down in 15 minutes. And if you go back and look, there are articles in the press about the increasing risk of more severe forest fires in British Columbia happening because of climate change for years before Lytton, BC. It's a climate-related disaster, and then 3 or 4 months later, the same area went through unbelievable and unprecedented flooding. So we know in Canada the very serious risks of not keeping overall global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And interestingly, the world's major cities, a year after Paris, recognized that 1.5 degrees had to be the threshold, and it became a condition of membership of C40 that each city had to have a climate plan in which that city pledged to do its fair share of overall global halving by 2030 on the way to net zero by 2050. And we said fair share because in the global north, we've contributed more to climate change than the global south. So we have more of an obligation to reduce emissions than places in the global south. So in fact, in the global north, we need to do more than 50%. That was established a year after Paris. And by Glasgow, last November, one more thing. The deadline for that was 2020. The program was called Deadline 2020. Behind it, there's a system of calculating emissions and of building city-based climate plans. Very loosely speaking, 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to cities. Most of the world's population lives in cities, and of those greenhouse gas emissions, most of them are from transportation, how we heat and cool buildings, how we manage our waste, and how we generate our electricity. So all of these cities committed to plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in those areas for certain, perhaps some other areas along the lines of what I said. And it meant in the global north, cities had to peak emissions by 2020, hence the name of Deadline 2020. So just a few facts that are really important in this context. From about 2009, 2008, maybe 2010 onwards, for the very first time in human history, the world became predominantly urban. Before then, it was predominantly rural, particularly because of the mass migrations in Asia, including China and Africa and Latin America. But not only because of those mass migrations, the world has now become an urban world, and the trends are that it's continuing becoming more and more urban. So for the first time in human history, we're an urban world. Most of the global economy is in cities. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions are in cities, as I said a minute ago. Most of the energy is in cities. And very worryingly, in developing countries, most of the urban expansion is near flood-prone areas like coastal, low-lying coastal areas and the mouths of great rivers. So cities are where the greenhouse gas emissions are. They're where the people are. They're where the economy is. And so they're also where the solutions are. So in my book, which was mentioned earlier, there it is, Solved, details a lot of methods that cities are doing to reduce emissions in those areas of transportation, buildings, waste, and electricity. And I won't get into too much of it for the purpose of this talk, but it's important to understand that there is a methodology commonly accepted that it addresses the same areas typically from city to city, and also that there are a lot of things happening today in these cities that are real, that are making a very real difference. For example, Los Angeles, which owns its own electric utility, is dramatically changing its grid over a very short period of time, one that was heavy on coal and oil. By 2031, it'll be entirely clean. Similar things are happening in Sydney, Australia, which has no legislative or legal authority over the energy grid. It's just purchasing clean energy and has thereby driven a massive transformation of the energy grid in Australia. Shenzhen, China has completely electrified its bus fleet, has 16,000 buses, completely electrified its taxi fleet. We've seen during the pandemic really significant moves in places like Barcelona and Paris to this idea of 15-minute cities. So cities being dense enough that people can walk and ride and use public transport and don't have to use private cars. We've seen massive public transport expansion in places as far apart as Medellin and Lisbon in Portugal. And we've seen really interesting work in places like Accra, Africa, on methane emissions from garbage, particularly in the informal settlements. So really significant actions. And the only reason I mention my book here is it's one source. There are many of what is actually happening in cities globally. Right. So in the post-Paris, C40 Cities committed that they, by 2020, would have a plan that peaked emissions in 2020, later in the global north, later if you're a global south city, on a path to having them by 2030, all on a path to net zero by 2050. The good news is that by COP26 in Glasgow last fall, over 70 of the cities could say that they had a plan, public, sometimes private in some countries, but a plan to do exactly that. So not all of the cities have achieved it, but if you compare where national governments are on their climate plans to where cities are, it's night and day. As of a couple of months ago, there was one national government in the world that was on track for its climate targets, one. And over 2/3 of C40 cities are on the way. And the very good news is in the run-up to COP, C40 and a number of other organizations, including the World Wildlife Fund and some other city-based environmental organizations like ICLEI, worked together, primarily driven by C40, but under the instigation of our then chair, Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles, we recruited another 1,000 global cities to make the same commitment. So there are now not just 100 cities having made the commitment to do their fair share of having global emissions by 2030. There are now 1,000. And all of those have committed to taking action in certain areas and to do this all transparently through known methodologies, either using C40's Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, World Wildlife Funds, or ICLEI's. They're all slightly different methodologies, but they come to the same conclusion, and they ensure that the cities are being transparent. At the same time, a new energy declaration. The way C40 works, the mayors, it's an organization of mayors, not just the cities. The mayors come together and set their ambition through a declaration, and then C40 brings together peer-to-peer knowledge-sharing networks to help make that real on-the-ground action. So the mayors from cities like Buenos Aires, Copenhagen, Lagos, Lisbon, London, Los Angeles, Melbourne, you can see on the slide, signed a declaration to say either they will use 100% renewable electricity citywide by 2035, or they would create universal access to it, or something meant towards Africa and other developing countries, they'll at least achieve 50% of that. So very, very powerful declarations, political statements, very powerful actions in cities like Shenzhen and Los Angeles. Oh, I didn't mention buildings. Vancouver, Canada probably has the world's best building code. It's quite remarkable to me that the Canadian building code, which is just advisory, is still out for consultation after years of being out for consultation. We've got the best example in the world in Vancouver. forcing buildings to achieve extremely high energy standards, energy reduction standards very quickly. New York City on existing buildings has a mandate. And by 2030, you have to cut your carbon emissions from any commercial building over a certain size in half. Extremely bold and effective action. So the final point I wanted to make is just to illustrate how this comes together and why it matters, and where initiatives like the one you're thinking about need to fit in a city's approach to climate. So in Toronto, in 2007, passed our first climate plan. It was called Changes in the Air. It had something well over 130 recommendations in the areas I've spoken about. There were really significant programs to lower greenhouse gas consumption from buildings. We had initiatives like deep lake water cooling, which took most of the downtown office towers off electric air conditioning and put it on to using cool lake water. That mattered very much at the time because air conditioning was a peaking function. So when electricity demand went up to its peak, and in Ontario at that time, or at least in and around Toronto, the peaking power was still from Lakeview coal-fired plants. So it was really significant greenhouse gas reductions, massive public transport, expansions and increases in bus service, which often doesn't get the credit it deserves, although I'm sure it does in Ottawa because of its excellent bus system with the busways. And very significant commitment to not only reducing waste, but to capturing methane from landfills and a very significant effort to compost. As a result of this plan and its renewal 10 years later, Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions are now 33% below what they were in 1990, which was the year of the Kyoto Accord, and originally it was what we measured everything against for climate. And Toronto has been hugely economically successful since that time. One of its biggest public policy challenges, of course, is the price of housing. So nobody can suggest that the economy has suffered. If anything, it's been done too well, while the city has ensured that the geographic area of Toronto, this isn't just the city operations, the geographic area has cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 33%. Now it's stalled and more needs to be done, and I'm happy to talk about that in questions. But the fundamental point I want to make is city-based climate action works. And that 33% was achieved through all of the kinds of city-based actions I'm speaking about, and the province closing the Lakeview power plant, which was counted for the purposes of the city's emissions. The Green Building Bylaw was an extremely important part of this initiative, and how it came about was very interesting from my perspective, because I was anxious to get it through because Toronto was booming particularly from a condominium development perspective, and I was very concerned that the buildings that were being built were not being built in a way that was responsible to the environment. But planning staff persuaded me that we should bring in something voluntary and work with the development industry to get them on board. And I sort of reluctantly agreed. Well, I quite reluctantly agreed, but I did agree. And the main reason I agreed was I was concerned there was an argument that it wasn't within the City of Toronto's power to use its planning powers to impose environmental standards on new developments. And by the way, the bylaw isn't just about the quality of the buildings, like LEED and LEED Platinum and those kinds of things. It's also about where they're located, the density, is it contributing to stopping sprawl? And does it have good transit access, walking, cycling? So all of those things are part of the bylaw. But what happened, so because I was concerned that we might face a legal challenge, I did agree with the staff advice ultimately. And what happened was, after a bit of a bumpy beginning, the development industry bought in. And for me, it showed something really fundamentally important, that cities can use their existing powers and push the envelope in order to meet important challenges for their residents. And of course, the Supreme Court of Canada has said this. It said this in a case called Hudson about pesticides, in which Hudson banned the cosmetic use of pesticides on public health grounds. And the Supreme Court said, the standard isn't whether you're perfectly right. The standard is, do you have a valid public purpose for public health? And we use that kind of logic in creating this bylaw and in working with the development industry. And it was very successful. Now, I think the implementation of it hasn't been as rigorous after I left office, but it's still there and still a good precedent. And I'm very encouraged to hear the work that's going on in Ottawa, because it sounds to me like it's interpreting municipal powers in the same broad way as done in Hudson, which is really important. Because if we are going to address climate change in a world where national governments, sadly including Canada's, aren't doing nearly enough, and if we have to act over the next 8 years to have emissions, the place that it's going to happen is in cities. That's where the emissions are, that's where the people are, that's where the economy is. And it's also where we know how to build really low or zero emission buildings. We know how to retrofit existing buildings so they're really low emissions. We know how to build transportation systems that are zero emissions. We know how to dramatically lower emissions from waste. So we know already and are implementing somewhere in the world exactly the right kinds of things to help the world get to where it needs to go. It's a closely run thing from my perspective, but it's critically important that citizens speak up and that city councils like Ottawa's follow the lead of the best cities in the world, and in fact surpass it and challenge other cities to do better. One final point, and then I'll take questions. All of this is in the context of equity, and it's extremely important from my perspective to embed equity in climate plans. And that's what we did in Toronto. I mentioned that part of our plan was a rapid transit expansion. It was called Transit City. It was by light rail on the surface for the most part, except Eglinton, which had to be tunneled downtown because the road was too narrow. Some of this is being built, some of it's caught up in political footballs, but that's not the point. As part of the climate plan, we launched a transit plan. The transit plan mattered from a transportation perspective, from a development perspective, because having really good rapid transit is a bulwark against sprawl, because you can build around the rapid transit more dense communities. And it was also a social justice initiative. And on the left, you'll see at the time, the City of Toronto made neighborhoods that had the highest correlation between low incomes and a lack of public investment in public service, like community centers, libraries, job training programs for youth, and so forth. We made them a priority for investments. And what the transit plan did, because it was partly planned on where the busiest bus routes are, and people, low-income people, are often the biggest bus users in a city like Toronto. The statistics in Ottawa are probably a little bit different because of the nature of its bus system. What the Transit City Plan did was connect all of these priority neighborhoods into the rapid transit fabric of the city. And that's exceptionally important, because not only do you then have a climate plan that creates a transit plan that is a development plan, it is also a way that those who are least well off can start to benefit from the vibrant life of the city. And when we were consulting about this, I took the Shepherd East bus one morning and met a woman who asked me what I was doing. And I said, I'm talking to people about the Shepherd East LRT. She said, what's that? I said, it's kind of European trams that run in the middle of the road so they don't get stuck in rush hour traffic. They're in their own right of way, and they'll get you where you're going much faster and much more likely to be on time. She said, that would really help me. And I said, where are you going? And she said, to work at Pearson. She was almost as far east as you can go in Scarborough. Pearson was probably 40 kilometers away. And I said, how do you go? She said, subway, or bus, subway, bus, bus, takes me 2 hours if I make my connections. Now, that woman can't participate in the life of the city because in order to put food on the table, she has to be on transit literally 4 hours a day. And that means she might not even be able to have dinner with her family. She certainly can't take the opportunity like my mom did, who graduated from Carleton University at the age of 56 to upgrade herself so she could get a better job. She can't take the opportunity to go back to school in the evenings, and she can't even go to the community meetings and democratically argue for increased rapid transit in her neighborhood because she's stuck on the bus. So a climate plan, a good climate plan, doesn't just address climate. It addresses the economy, it addresses development, it addresses transportation, and most of all, it addresses social justice. And that's why it's so critical to address climate, and it's also why I'm somewhat optimistic, because the best mayors and the best city councils want to do exactly that. They want to build a city where everybody really has a chance and no one is left behind, and that's what addressing climate does. So it's been a bit longer than I said. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to the questions and the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Very informative, very inspiring. We're grateful, and we have a lot of chat in the chat box. So I know a lot of questions, and we probably won't get to all of them, but we'll try a few. I'm going to start off with one from Mary. You touched on how city communities can lead, but I think Mary wants to hear a little bit more about how we local communities can help implementing the local plans for climate adaptation, and how the Knowledge Hub from C40 might assist local communities. Lessons for Ottawa. Yeah.
A couple of things. One of the things you might want to look to and advocate for in Ottawa, and I don't know the current city council that well. I apologize. I know it very well while I was in office and for a few years after. So I don't know the lie of the land. But in Toronto, as part of our climate plan, we had something called Live Green Toronto, which was a fund that had relatively small grants for neighborhood-based climate action. And we also hired people to work with low-income neighborhoods on the theory that moderate and higher income neighborhoods, people will self-organize, but in low-income neighborhoods, they might need some assistance to help them create projects to access the climate funds. I think that's one very important kind of program, because it's structural and it creates a structure to support neighborhood and community. Secondly, in terms of advocating, the C40 Knowledge Hub is a very useful place. It's a compendium written in non-technical language of leading climate actions taken in cities. And the one thing I didn't stress enough in the right way, there is a city somewhere that is solving almost every big piece of what we need to do, whether it's build new buildings to incredibly high standards, retrofit old buildings, densify cities in a proper way that's livable and has great green space, for example, and is built around public transport, walking and cycling. All of these things are happening somewhere, and many of them will contain gems that are suitable for Ottawa. Not all of the policies will work in Ottawa. It's got its own, its own kind of geography, but many could. And the Knowledge Hub, as Mary pointed out, is a really good place. Really easy. Just go on c40.org and go to the Knowledge Hub, and you'll find some interesting articles. Hopefully by the end of the year, for those of you who are more academically inclined, you'll see some really interesting academic articles through the center that I'm leading, but we're not there yet.
Great. Thank you, David. The next question is about green space and the role of green space in climate solutions, and particularly what about how we increase population density in cities without destroying all the existing green space, because we're having a lot of challenges here in Ottawa on this issue, actually.
For a long time, I've supported density, but it's got to be in the right place and built the right way. And if you look at older cities like even Boston in the US, they can be very dense without always being a city of towers. And to me, if we're going to be successful economically and socially as a city, and from an environmental perspective, we have to figure out that balance of density. Be a little different in Ottawa, but in Toronto, it means to me that people should welcome 8 to 10-story buildings on streets like Bloor and Yonge and Eglinton, where there is rapid transit as of right. That only works, though, if you've got really good public green space and parks and simply green space that you can be in that isn't a manicured park. It's really, really essential. And I think, unfortunately, it's an area that gets a bit neglected because the planning laws in Toronto in Ontario, allow developers to pay instead of providing parkland. And I think it really needs to be fought over. And green space is something that crosses philosophical lines. I think people from different philosophical perspectives really, really value it. And if you accompany it with an argument that you can accept some more density because it's the right thing for the environment and the economy, but there must be green space, I think you can make a very powerful and successful argument. For me, you can't build the kinds of cities that we're going to need to live in the future that are vibrant, interesting, welcoming, without really excellent public space. And if you look at my neighborhood in Toronto, we're across from Hyde Park, and we're about a 15-minute walk from the Humber River Valley. So we've got manicured green space, we've got playing fields, we've got the Humber Valley's a bit more wild. There's coyotes in it. Incredibly important. And I live in an extremely dense neighborhood. There are 19 tall apartment buildings within 3 blocks of my house. So I think, to me, that's an example of how a neighborhood can really thrive. And if the green space wasn't there, the neighborhood would really struggle.
Great, thank you. I have one more timely question about the green standards and buildings. As we mentioned, that Ottawa's new green standard will apply at most to 40% of our new builds. And so we're wondering about your reaction to that, as we know that Toronto has a good record on producing concepts and resources for ramping up deep energy retrofits. So again, what lessons might we apply here and in addressing our green standards here?
Well, a couple of lessons. I think the principles need to be bold, and you should support members of council who are trying to be bold, which means that the standards should apply to as many buildings as possible. Now, you want to make the biggest difference, so it is bigger buildings. I don't think that you'd start with 2-story buildings, for example. You might start with subdivisions. But to me, you want to include all buildings over a certain size, whatever the size is for Ottawa, residential and commercial. I think that's really important. And I would argue to support councillors who have the right principle and figure out a way to implement it that ensures it actually does get implemented and succeed, because that's what really matters. But the examples in my book, on the FCM website, on C40's Knowledge Hub, all show what's possible, not just on this issue, but on a myriad of others. And if you can ensure that, the next mayor is a climate leader and has a council that are climate leaders, the things that can be done are incredible, because they'll have the support of the people. Couple of just quick points, if I could, in response to a couple of things in the chat. Ottawa isn't a C40 member because C40 members need to be either one of the world's largest cities with a minimum population of 3 million in the city region, or one of the world's best leaders from a city perspective on climate. And Ottawa isn't the first and hasn't been the second. Secondly, somebody asked me about green space I like in Ottawa. We, in Canterbury Park and Community Centre, in the late 60s, we had an outdoor hockey rink which had a little shack that was heated by a wood stove. And I still have frostbite in my feet from learning to skate as a young immigrant from England, 9 years old, plunked on this rink at 35 below zero, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It was just such magic seeing all these other boys and girls whiz around me in circles while I stood there and froze with my ankles bent, and it was just fantastic. And I just loved that rink and that park, which was right across the street from our apartment buildings. And maybe that's why, for me, I have that connection between green space and density, because that's where I grew up in Ottawa.
Great, thank you. I think that will lead us to our last question this evening. In addition to the green space that we grapple with density, is also affordable housing. So affordable housing is not only a major issue across Canada, but here in Ottawa. And so are there some lessons about solving the affordable housing and the climate crises at the same time that you would share with us?
Yes, I'd take two. Reasonable density. I don't mean unreasonable density. I don't mean building a 30-story building in the midst of single-family homes. But regional density matters, and I think cities need to start using their planning authority to push back against the provincial building code on the size of units, because there are very few family units. We tried to do this in Toronto. It's hard, it's complicated, and I don't think we succeeded, but that really matters. You need to have lots more places for people to live, and the best way to do that that's consistent with addressing the climate crisis is density. The second thing, and this is an idea that's gone out of fashion, but I really believe that we need to think much more about the role of government in owning housing or land, or partnering by owning the land with people like the cooperative movement. You know, we need to ensure that housing is affordable over the long term. The fact that the land value under housing goes up so high in city centers needs to be taken out of the equation somewhat. And Singapore has a system, for example, where there is housing for the middle class that is essentially government owned. And I think we need to think much, much more creatively about how do we use public land in a way that ensures that housing remains affordable over the long run, probably affordable rental, and what entities can we create that provides that affordability, not just for really wealthy people and really low income people, but for everybody in between, which is the vast majority.
Great. Thank you so much. I invite everyone to share a wonderful thank you. It's so hard to have these Zoom meetings when we don't get to share our gratitude to you with clapping, but we do thank you so much, David, for being with us here this evening and sharing lessons from Toronto and other cities around the world. And we're really keen to move forward in seeing what we can apply in this very important year for us here in Ottawa. So thank you for sharing knowledge and inspiration with us this evening, and we wish you very well. Take care.
Thank you very much.